In this video, we are going to cover the place layout method. What we are going to create is going to look something like this. Once again, not a particularly pretty app, but it definitely teaches you quite a bit. On top of that, this one is quite flexible, and here you can see a couple of different effects. I'll explain them as we go along. So let's talk about place. Widgets are placed by specifying the left, the top, the width, and the height of the widget. This is a very flexible system. Also, I think a fairly simple one to understand. Although, when you are placing widgets, you can do this in two ways. You can either use absolute or relative values. Let's start by talking about absolute values. For this, we once again have a window or any kind of container, doesn't really matter. And this container right now is 400 pixels wide and 800 pixels tall. If we want to place a widget inside of this, we would have to specify at least 2, but ideally 4 values. These 4. The values we absolutely have to specify are these 2 values here. Those are crucial. With these points, we are placing the left and the top of the widget, which is this point here. In this particular example, the top left of the widget is 100 pixels from the left side and 200 pixels from the top. Besides that, we can also specify the width and the height of the widget. These numbers are optional. If you don't specify them, the widget is going to have the size of its content. Let's do another example. We have a widget all the way at the bottom. For this one, we once again would have to get the top left point. This one has 0 pixels from the left, and from the top we have something like, let's say, 500 pixels. The widget is about, let's say, 200 pixels tall, and it has the entire width of the window or the container, which is 400. And that's it. I hope the system makes sense. Besides that, we have relative values. For this, again, we have a window or any kind of container. But instead of specifying a specific width or height, instead, we separate this thing into a coordinate system that starts from 0 and goes all the way to 1. And this we do both for x and for y. Which means that this point in the top left always has the coordinate 0.0 and 0.0. One for y and the other for x. The bottom right point of the container then is 1.0 and 1 point for both axes. That way, if you want to place a widget, you would have to do it like this. Instead of specifying a specific distance like we have done here, we are telling the widget or the left side of the widget to be 10% of the width of the widget, or 20% from the top of the widget. We can also do this with the width and the height. For example, we can tell the widget to have 40% or 10% of the width or height of the container. Other than that, the system works in exactly the same way. So if we do another example, for this widget, the left position is still going to be 0. Let's put a 0 here. For the top position, this one is going to be a bit larger. Let's say this one would be 0.6. The height of the entire widget would be, I don't know, let's say 0.2. Finally, the width of this thing is going to be a 1 because I want this to cover the entire width of the container. Once again, that's basically it for the basics of place. It's quite simple. So let's have a look at all of this in code. I already have a few lines of code ready. If I execute all of this, all we can see is a basic window. The reason for that is that these widgets are not being placed on the window. Let's create a layout then. I am going to start with label 1, and this I want to place using the place method. For this one, we at the very least need x and y coordinates. And let me use some really simple numbers, x being 0 and y being 0. If I run this now, we can see label 1 in the top left. I guess I should talk about the widgets we have. We have 3 labels, label 1, 2, and 3. They all say the same thing. Basically, they just have different background colors. Red, blue, and green. Besides that, we have a button. Since we only have one button, I guess I can rename this just to button. There we go. Now, if I run this again, we can see label 1 in the top left. The reason for that is that the entire container, the window in this case, is going to be a coordinate system that goes something like this, with the origin point being up here, or rather more specifically up here. This point is 0 and 0. If you want to go further to the right, we have to increase x, and if you want to go downwards, we have to increase y. So plus y and plus x. If you are only familiar with high school math, this might be a tiny bit confusing, because in high school math, if you want to go up, you have to increase y, which we are not doing in this case, which can be a tiny bit confusing. You will get used to it quite fast. And, well, all we have to do now is play around with these values. For example, if I change x to 100 and y to, let's go with 200. If I run this now, we can see a difference. What we have is x being 100, meaning we have a distance of 100 pixels between the left side of the container, this side here, and the left side of the widget. This distance is 100 pixels. Other than that, we have y, and this tells us that from the top of the container to the top of the widget, we have 200 pixels of a difference. What we can also do is set a width and a height. For example, the width could be 200. Actually, let's go with 300, so we have different numbers. And for the height, I want to go with 50. Let's run this now, and there we go. The widget is much wider and a tiny bit taller. By default, a widget is only going to take up the space it needs to display the text, which by default would be something like this. But if we specify numbers for width and height, we are setting the width in this case to 50, and the height is going to be 300. That's very hard to read, sorry about that. We can play around with the numbers here quite a bit. For example, x could be 300, y could be 100, and let's say for the width we have 100, and for the height we have 200, and now we get a different kind of widget that is all the way on the right. To understand the numbers here, we know that the entire widget is 400 pixels wide. This thing is 400 pixels. And we are placing the left side 300 pixels from the left side of the window. This distance here is 300 pixels. On top of that, we are setting the width of the widget to 100 pixels, meaning this distance here is going to be 100. As a consequence, the widget ends exactly on the right side of the container. After that, for y, we have 100, meaning this distance here is 100, and then we are setting the height to 200, so this one here is 200. All of that, I think, should be reasonably straightforward. With that, we have covered the absolute positioning. Besides that, we can place label 2, and for this one, I want to use relative positions. This we do in a similar way. We still have to specify x and y values, except now they're called relative x or rel x and relative y or rel y. In here, just to get started, I can again set 0 and 0. Running this now, we can see label 2 all the way in the top left. Although now I don't specify pixels, instead if I set this to 0.5 and let's set y to 0.2, the top left position of the widget, this point here, is exactly in the middle of the window, meaning we have 0.5 to the left and 0.5 to the right, 0.5, like so. And then from the top, we have 20%, but I think it's not too difficult to understand. If we use different numbers, let's say 0.2 and 0.1, we should be a bit closer to the top left. We can also specify the width and height in a relative way. This we do with relative width or with relative height. For this one, let's say I want to have 40% of the width of the container and let's say 50% of the height. And if I run this now, we have a much larger container. I think the numbers here are fairly straightforward. I don't think the system is very difficult, so it shouldn't be too hard to understand, but drop a comment if you think it's super complicated. What we can do as an exercise to make this a bit more interesting is I want you guys to place label 3. Label 3 should be positioned using absolute numbers, meaning we have x, y, we have the width, and we have the height. And label 3 should be exactly in the same position as label 2, meaning you have to convert these numbers to X and Y positions. Pause the video now and see if you can figure this one out. To convert these numbers, you have to know the size of the container, which in our case is the window. For example, for X, we have to convert 400 by 0.2, which is going to be 80. Y is 0.1 of 600, which is just 60. The width is 40% of 400, which is 160, like so. And height is 0.5 of 600, which is 300. That should be all. If I run this now, we can see label 3 covering all of label 2. That looks pretty good. And, well, with that, we can see that relative and absolute positioning works pretty well together. Although, that being said, you do want to use relative positioning. I can demonstrate why quite easily. Here we have the app again. Right now, this is looking really good. But once I start to move the window around, we get some massive differences. The problem here is that label 2 is relative. Let me move it to the side, like so. The only widget that scales along with the window is label 2, this one here. It scales along with the widget because we are always using relative values. Whereas label 1 and label 3 have absolute positioning, so those two do not move, regardless of what the window is doing. If you wanted to scale those, you would have to update the value every time you are changing the size of the window, which would be kind of a pain. In 90% of the cases, you want to use relative positioning because this one is much more flexible. There's one more case that I do want to cover. I want to place this button. And where I want to place it, let me run the app again. The button should be in the bottom right corner of the window, down here. This I can't really do right now, although we can get started. Once again, I want to get my button. I want to use the place method, and I want to use relative positioning. Let's set relative x to 1 and relative y to 1 as well. If I run this now, we cannot see the button. The reason is that we are placing the top left of the button in this corner here. But then the rest of the widget goes in this direction and this direction, meaning the button is this yellow outline, which is just outside of the window, but we just cannot see it. This obviously is a problem, so we have to learn about another argument that we can control what is called the anchor. When we're using the place method, the anchor controls which point is placed. By default, if this one is the widget, we are setting the top left point. But this you can customize. And here we have all the points you can use. The default here is northwest, which is telling tkinter to place the left and the top of the widget, which is giving us this point. That's the default one. That being said, we could also tell tkinter to place the southeast of the widget, and then we will place this point here. Besides that, you could also tell tkinter to place the center of the widget, then you will place this point. If you know the grid method, this should look fairly familiar. Let's play around with it. For my button, I want to set the anchor, and that is atrocious spelling. That looks much better. We need a string, and I want to place the southeast point. Running this now we can see the button. This one works as always, it's a button. To see a bit better what's happening here, I am going to place the center. Now we can only see the top left area of the button. The reason for that is we are placing the center of the button in the bottom right of the window, or the container to be more specific. That way we can only see the top left and the rest is cut off. I do want to cover one extra case, and that is using the place method along with a frame. I want to create a frame with ttk and frame. The master here is going to be the window. After that, I want to create two widgets. One is going to be a frame label, which is going to be ttk and label with the window as the master, and the text could be frame label. On top of that, I want to give this thing a background color, which we can set to yellow. That's the one we haven't used yet. Besides that, I'm going to duplicate the entire line and change frame label to a frame button. This is going to be TTK and button, and the button is not going to have a background color. Also, this should be frame button to be a bit more consistent. What I now want to do is to place this frame using the place method and also add these two frame labels inside of this frame. And for that, I have already seen one problem. And that is that this label and this button need to have the master as the frame, because I want to place those two inside of the frame. This I want to do in another section. I'm going to call this one layout, frame layout looks good. First of all, I want to place the frame itself, which I do with the place method. And this one, I want to have the relative x position of 0 and the relative y position of 0 as well. That way it's in the top left. The width, I want to have 0.3, and the relative height is going to be 1. That way, if I run the entire thing, we can't really see it. But the frame we have just created is going to cover an area roughly this size. And I am very, very bad at drawing straight lines. Inside of this, I want to place the frame label and the frame button. I will start with the frame label. I'm going to use place again. For relative x, I want to have 0. Relative y is also going to be 0, meaning this label is in the top left. And besides that, I want to cover the entire width, so relative width is 1, and relative height is going to be 0.5. And there we go. We have a frame label that covers 1/3 of the window. What you really have to understand here is that place always works relative to the container, which in this case is the frame. Right now, the width of the frame is this width here, which means when we are specifying relative width of 1 for the frame label, we are telling this frame label here to cover this entire width, the width of the container. If the frame label had the master as the window, then it would cover the entire width of the window. What you want to keep in mind here, the parent or the master is incredibly important for layouts. But once we have that, I also want to place the frame button. This one should take up the bottom half of this container. Relative x should still be 0, but relative y should be 0.5. The other numbers I think can remain identical. And that is looking pretty good. We have separated the space in half. And I can even drag the window around. This is still working just fine. Cool, I'm really happy with that. On top of that, for this button here, the one we created earlier, I want to set the anchor to southeast. So all of this looks a bit better. Righty, with that, we have covered all of the basics of the place method. All we have to do now is an exercise and then we are done. What I want you guys to do is this one here. Create a label and place it right in the center of the window. The label should be half as wide as the window and be 200 pixels tall. Also give it a background color to make it a bit nicer to look at. Which color you want to choose is entirely up to you. I am going to start by creating an exercise label. This is going to be TTK and label. The parent here is going to be the window. Text is going to be the exercise label. Finally, I want to have a background color. Let's go with orange. This exercise label I now want to place. The position here has to be right in the center of the window, which means I want to have relative x being 0.5 and relative y should also be 0.5. Running this now, we get the exercise label, although it's not perfectly centered. The point we have centered is the top left of the widget. What I want to do is to place the center of the widget right in the middle of the window. For that, I have to set the anchor to center. And I am somehow unable to spell anchor. Let's try it now. And there we go. This is looking much better. Finally, we have to set the width and the height of the label. It should be half as wide as the window and 200 pixels tall. Which means the relative width is going to be 0.5 and the height is going to be 200. I can run this now, and this is looking pretty good. On this line, I realized I didn't mention, but you can combine these values quite easily. So you could, for example, set the relative width and the height in pixels. They work together really, really well. The same could also be done with X and Y. For example, I could set X to, 200. And I think since the entire window is 400 pixels wide, this is still putting us in the middle of the window. You do want to be careful using this though, because if you now resize the window like so, things start to get a tiny bit weird. So just keep that in mind.